Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Dracula, the most famous vampire of all time. Everybody knows the name, and those who don't must not have left their coffin in the past few centuries. Let's say you're just now coming back to life. You know nothing from after 1815. First, let's take a quick trip down memory lane through the history of Dracula and his literary predecessors.
I am Dracula.
The year is 1816. Lord Byron and his physician, John William Polidori, visit Percy and Mary Shelley. Lord Byron proposes a ghost story writing contest, as was positively demolished by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, now one of the most famous pieces of horror literature of all time. However, Polidori also wrote a ghost story, The Vampire. Polidori based his antagonist, the seductive Lord Ruthven, on Byron himself, and this very story, published in 1819, served as one of the many inspirations for Bram Stoker's Dracula almost a century later. So, here we have a seductive vampire lord and his mysterious allure over young women. Classic vampire story. Now, Polidori's The Vampire is considered the first early English literature featuring a vampire. But this isn't the last vampire story before Dracula. In 1872, Sheridan Le Fanu published Carmilla, a lesbian novella telling the tale of a young woman being preyed upon by the seductive Countess Carmilla. Stoker was inspired by, or at the very least well aware of Carmilla, considering his short story Dracula's Guest featured a female vampire originally meant to be Carmilla. Dracula's Guest was a cut chapter from the full novel, but provides insight into Stoker's relationship with Carmilla. Dracula was published in 1897 to mixed audience reviews and a lasting legacy.
Thanks. It looks very inviting. Ouch.
Dracula follows a cast of characters as they experience Count Dracula's attempted reign of terror over England. From Transylvania to Whitby and all across England, the death toll rises as the Count claims more and more victims. But we only get to see the experiences of a select few. Jonathan Harker, his wife Mina, the three suitors of Lucius Stunra, and Abraham Van Helsing eventually track down the Count and kill him with a stake through the heart and the removal of his head. Of course, this method of killing isn't only reserved for Dracula. The now vampire Lucy and Dracula's three wives are killed in a similar manner. These methods of killing a vampire date back to mythology and real-life vampire panics. Over time, more and more adaptations of Dracula have been released, slowly changing the story and the very mythos behind vampires. Don't believe me? Let's ask some innocent victims. So when you think of vampires, is there any, strengths and weaknesses that just come to your mind?
Strength. They're definitely strong.
Think of, turning into, a bat.
I just can't eat garlic bread. There's burning in the sun, there's weakness maybe to silver. I mean, obviously sunlight.
Daylight. That's a weakness I can imagine.
Can't look in the mirror.
They can just turn into the bat.
More than anything, weakness to the sun and the steaks and garlic.
Times the ability to turn into a bat or a mist or just directly fly in the vampire's human-like form.
Or obviously sucking blood.
Garlic, wood, holy water.
They literally can't be outside during the day.
They can fly. They can literally just jump from a building to the... Hello? Love that.
They are often portrayed with the ability to sort of compel people, perhaps.
They're allergic to the sun, garlic.
There's the need to drink human blood to survive and an inability to eat human food.
Just sucking blood. That's the first thing.
As you can see, there's a pretty clear criteria that defines a vampire. Obviously, they drink blood and are immortal. They're weak to sunlight, garlic, steaks, and are generally rich and seductive. They cast no reflection and sometimes can't touch silver. Now, what if I told you that not all of these characteristics apply to Dracula? In the book, we learn that a wild rose on a vampire's coffin can keep him trapped inside. They must return to sleep in their native dirt at night, and they can ride on moonlight and become mist. Vampires can even control the meaner animals such as wolves, bats, rats, and cats. So, what happened? How come vampires today can't direct swarms of rats to their enemies and cause ships to lose their way? Why can't today's vampires bask in the sunlight while their counterparts centuries ago were perfectly fine at the beach? The answer is Dracula. To be more specific, Dracula on film.
What could have caused them, Professor?
Count Dracula.
We consider a vampire's weakness to sunlight one of his biggest defining features, but this was largely absent from the book. Dracula can walk around in broad daylight just fine, and the characters even see him with a potential victim in the middle of the day. This change was invented by none other than the 1922 film Nosferatu. Now, Nosferatu wasn't technically the first Dracula adaptation. There was an earlier lost Hungarian adaptation, but it is the most famous. It wasn't authorized by the Stoker estate, and as a result, all copies of the film were ordered to be destroyed. Clearly, this didn't work, as we can still watch the movie today. Directed by F.W. Murnau, a legendary filmmaker in the genre of German Expressionism, Nosferatu had to take some creative liberties to try and pass as a whole new film. One of these changes was the vampire's death. Count Orlok, the film's Dracula, is tricked into sucking Ellen, the film's Mina's, blood until the sun rises. Once the sun rises, the Count disintegrates. Understandably, this scene had a lasting impact. In 1931, affected by the many censorship laws of the time, the Universal adaptation had Dracula's death take place off-screen. The death of Count Orlok was the closest we got to seeing the vampire's destruction in all its glory. Now, with the added weakness to sunlight, Hammer Horror Productions amplified this new and exciting vampire death instead of the boring stake through the heart. In 1958, Dracula, also called Horror of Dracula, Dracula dies on screen in sunlight, a gory death befitting of a more scandalous production of Dracula. Later, in 1972, Mamuwalde gloriously walks into sunlight, killing himself in the end of Blackula. Now, cinematically, the vampire has a wonderful new exploitable weakness: sunlight.
Master, what are you doing out in the daytime? Relax, Redfield. I am pure. No, you're not.
Like Wendy and Peter Pan, Murnau also gave the vampire back his shadow. In the book, Dracula cannot see himself in the mirror, nor can he cast a shadow. He exists in a state between death and undeath, thus is unable to be seen in reflection of light. The most famous scene from Nosferatu shows the vampire's shadow creeping up a set of stairs, effectively squashing this part in mythology for the purpose of better filmmaking. So, now that we know where a vampire's weakness to sunlight came from, what about the lack of other abilities? Well, that largely amounts to the lack of budget in the 1931 adaptation. Being based on the stage adaptation and not the novel, the 1931 adaptation was also produced with the lowest budget possible. This is the very reason the man synonymous with the Count, Bela Lugosi, was cast. Lugosi was willing to work for the least amount of money. Lugosi also refused to wear any heavy makeup and fangs, thus making the Dracula we know very clearly Lugosi's image. In the book, Dracula is initially unappealing, hairy, and has terrible breath. Not exactly the image of vampires everyone imagines. In fact, my innocent victims would agree.
Is he handsome to you? Is he hot? Or is he like ugly?
He can be.
I think they're hot and sexy and cool.
He's probably really hot.
Very pale white man.
Very regal, kind of count-like.
He's super cool. Seductive.
I hate to say it, but he's definitely fucking sexy.
The Great Depression's massive impact on the 1931 adaptation, as well as the lack of good special effects, meant that the easiest thing the Count could turn into was a bat. And I guess there are some armadillos in the movie. Not sure what they're doing. The classic bat on a string is now heavily associated with vampires. Vampires have their bats, werewolves have their wolves, and Nosferatu has rats. There's no longer room for overlap. While 1992's Bram Stoker's Dracula showed Dracula as a wolf-like monster and implemented the mist, this movie also heavily changed the vampire's story. While it didn't exactly contribute anything new to the genre, it did change the character of Dracula for the foreseeable future. Thankfully, due to movies such as Renfield and Last Voyage of the Demeter in 2023, we are back to our roots with evil, monstrous Dracula. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, not to be confused with Bram Stoker's book, the movie is called Bram Stoker's Dracula, Dracula is irrefutably tied to the real-life historical figure of Vlad the Impaler. Now, as I said before, there were a lot of inspirations that created Dracula. You can't discredit Lord Ruthven and Carmilla's impact on the character. In fact, I'd say they impacted him just as much as Vlad the Impaler did. But if Dracula isn't Vlad the Impaler, who is he? Well, according to the book, Dracula was an alchemist in life, the opposite of Van Helsing's good scientist. But being a scientist and nerd isn't really as interesting as being a real-life historical figure who shares your name. That isn't to say Vlad the Impaler didn't inspire Dracula in a sense. Bram Stoker liked the name Dracula for its connotation with the devil, and was inspired by Transylvanian folktales. But that's about as much as an impact the historical figure had on the character. With the 1992 film officially tying the two together, almost all Dracula media since has now stated the character and the historical figure to be the same. Is this a good thing? Maybe. Depends on who you ask. So, over time, with more and more movies, Dracula lost his history and some of his cooler abilities and became more and more sympathetic. No longer a pure monster, he's now a heartbroken lover looking for his lost wife. I won't get into the whole reincarnated lover aspect of Dracula that has single-handedly destroyed the girl bossing My Queen Mina did in the book. That's an adventure for another day. But it is important to remember our roots when it comes to Dracula media.
Aren't you drinking?
I never drink. Why?
Yeah, vampires are cool, but what's cooler than vampires? The history and stories behind how they are the way that they are today. Let's raise our glasses and toast to the Vampire King, blood preferably. He doesn't drink wine. And celebrate everything that makes the modern vampire what we love. And while we're at it, let's shout out my victims' favorite vampires.
Dracula.
I think that Bella Swan's hot.
Dracula from Monster High.
Edward. My babysitter is the vampire, Vanessa Morgan's character.
Damon Salvatore.
Dracula.
Bela Lugosi. The original.
The vampire Armand from the Vampire Chronicles.
I also really like Mavis.
That has to be Carmilla.
Say probably Kate Beckinsale's vampire.
Carmilla, the lesbian vampire. Love her.
Go forward and spread this information to your peers. After all, you've just risen from the grave and have nothing better to do. For those of you wondering why you would just watch this entire video and still have no idea why you should care, it's simple. Vampires are fucking cool. Go forth into the night on rays of moon, and remember to drink your blood responsibly.